All right, ready to jump into Chapter 6.
Sounds good to me.
This is Being and Sounding Natural, from a Practical EmPath, Rewire Your Mind, by Scott Howard Swain.
Okay, getting right into it. I like it.
It's funny, this chapter kind of tackles a fear I think we all have when we first learn about P.E.P.
You mean how to actually use it without sounding like,
Exactly, like some kind of robot therapist or something.
Yeah, Swain really gets that. It's a common concern. People worry about coming off weird if they use P.E.P. in real life.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
But one of the first things he does, he talks about this difference between natural communication and habitual communication.
Okay, curious. What's the distinction there?
So he's saying, like, deep down, being empathetic is our natural state.
Makes sense. We're social creatures, after all. Wired for connection.
Right. But then, somewhere along the way, we develop these bad habits. Like, imagine we were all born knowing how to swim, but then someone taught us this super awkward, inefficient stroke.
I can picture it. Flailing around, getting nowhere fast.
Exactly. So we end up struggling to connect, even though it's in our nature to do so.
And so P.E.P., the practical empathy practice system, is like, what? Giving us the right swimming technique?
It's more like those floaties you use when you're first learning. It's there to help us get the hang of it, until we can ditch them and just swim freely.
I see. So P.E.P. isn't meant to be this rigid script we follow forever.
Exactly. It's about building the skill of empathy, not becoming some robotic dialogue machine.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's like training wheels for our empathy muscles.
Totally. And speaking of training, Swain uses this really cool kung fu analogy.
Kung fu, huh? I'm listening.
So he compares learning P.E.P. to mastering those kung fu forms. Have you ever seen those?
Oh, yeah. The ones that seem super structured, almost like a dance.
Yeah. They're like all precise movements and stuff. But with practice.
This practice, they help you develop fluidity, right? And spontaneity.
Exactly. Which you can then apply in a real fight, even though a fight doesn't look like the form.
You're better because of it, though. You've built those foundational skills.
Right. So even though P.E.P. might feel kind of formulaic at first, the goal is to internalize it so deeply that you can respond empathetically without even thinking about it.
It becomes second nature, just like those kung fu moves.
Yes. You're building this foundation for genuine connection. And this is where Swain gets really practical, because he actually compares what he calls clinical P.E.P., which, let's be honest, can sound a bit robotic.
Oh, yeah, definitely. A little too textbook sometimes.
Right. He compares that to natural P.E.P.,
yeah,
which is more, conversational, more relatable.
Okay, so how does that play out in a real conversation?
So he gives this example. Imagine someone's upset because you had to cancel plans.
Happens all the time, right?
And they say something like, I can't believe you bailed again, so inconsiderate.
Ouch, a little harsh, but yeah, I've been there.
So the clinical P.E.P. response might sound something like, I observe frustration in your tone. Are you feeling disappointed because your need for reliability is not being met?
Oof. Yeah, no, that's giving very much therapist.
Exactly. But then Swain gives the natural P.E.P. response, which is just, sounds like you're feeling pretty down.
Oh, wow. Okay. That is so much better. It just feels human.
Right. And Swain really emphasizes that it's not just about the words themselves, but also about breaking down that P.E.P. formula.
Meaning you don't have to cram it all into one sentence.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can start by just acknowledging the feeling, then maybe guess at the value or need behind it and see where the conversation goes from there.
Okay. That makes it feel a lot less intimidating, less pressure to get it right immediately.
Right. It's about being present, responding authentically. He even suggests avoiding the word needs altogether because it can sound too clinical. Instead, use words like wants, values, or motives.
Interesting. Just a subtle shift, but I can see how it would make a difference.
Like, instead of saying, when you chew with your mouth open, I'm feeling anxious because my need for hygiene is not being met, you could say something like, when you chew with your mouth open, it kind of makes me worry about germs.
Haha. Yeah, that's definitely more natural. Gets the point across without sounding like a textbook. And Swain says, sometimes it's even okay to just acknowledge the feeling without explicitly stating the need or want.
Like, just keep it simple.
Exactly. It's about being responsive to the other person in that moment, meeting them where they're at. Okay, but before we move on, you mentioned something at the end of the last part about Swain's thoughts on specific language, things like profanity and word choice. I feel like that could be a whole episode on its own.
Oh, totally. It's such a fascinating topic, and Swain doesn't shy away from it. He actually thinks curse words can be powerful.
Really? So he's not totally anti-profanity?
Nope. He even says they can be impactful. But, like anything, like a strong spice, you don't want to overdo it.
I like that analogy. You wouldn't dump a whole jar of chili flakes on your pasta, right?
Exactly. You just need a little sprinkle to add some flavor. Swain's point is that overusing profanity can lead to some not-so-great judgments from others.
Yeah, I guess people might think you lack self-control.
Or that you're not very intelligent.
Right. It can definitely affect how seriously people take you.
Though, I do think societal norms around swearing are constantly evolving, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, think about how much more commonplace it is now than it was, say, 50 years ago.
Totally. But I still get Swain's point. It's about being mindful of your audience and the context. Like, a casual conversation with friends is different from a work meeting.
Absolutely. And speaking of being mindful, Swain also talks about avoiding unnecessary filler words and phrases.
Oh, you mean all those likes and ums?
Yes. All the you-knows and sort-ofs. He calls it verbal clutter, and while it's natural to some extent, too much of it can distract from our message.
It's kind of like having a messy desk. It's hard to find what you're looking for when there's stuff everywhere.
Perfect analogy. Swain encourages us to be more concise and deliberate with our words. But, he also acknowledges that sometimes clarity requires more effort.
Meaning, it's okay to use more words if it helps get your point across more effectively.
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot between conciseness and clarity. And also being sensitive to the needs of the listener. Some people just need more detail, while others catch on quickly.
Yeah, it's about adapting your communication style to the person you're talking to. Okay, so we've talked about this idea of natural P.E.P. versus clinical P.E.P., and we've touched on some key communication tips. But I'm really curious to see it in action. Does Swain give any real-world examples?
Oh, he does. He calls them street P.E.P. conversations. Basically, they're these short snippets of dialogue that show how to use P.E.P. in a natural, conversational way.
Ooh, like little cheat sheets for empathy. I'm all ears.
He covers a variety of scenarios, like dealing with a micromanaging boss, navigating disagreements with a partner, feeling unheard in meetings, even managing frustration with kids who don't do their chores.
Relatable.
Right.
Super relatable. Especially that micromanaging boss one. I think we've all been there at some point.
Right. Okay, so picture this. You say to a friend, "Ugh, I'm so tired of constantly being micromanaged at work." Now, the street P.E.P. response isn't to jump in with advice or solutions. It's just, "Oh, your boss was keeping tabs on every detail of your work again."
That's it. Seems so simple.
It is. But it's about acknowledging the situation without judgment, just creating space for them to elaborate, and you know what they say next.
Yeah. Lame.
Something like that. Exactly. And then the P.E.P. response takes a guess at the feeling. Were you feeling overwhelmed?
I see. So you're not assuming you know exactly how they feel. You're checking in.
Exactly. And in this case, the person clarifies, more like annoyed and frustrated. I'd also like to hear some appreciation from her for once.
So by listening actively and asking clarifying questions, you actually get a clearer picture of what's going on for them.
Right. And then you can respond in a way that is truly supportive. Like in this case, the response is, "I hear you about how frustrating that is. Would it help if you got some recognition for what you do?"
Instead of trying to fix it, you're focusing on validating their feelings and exploring their needs.
And opening the door for a more collaborative approach to problem solving.
Wow. I'm starting to see how this street P.E.P. stuff can be really powerful. It's not about these grand gestures or long, drawn-out conversations. It's the small, subtle shifts in how we communicate.
Totally. It's about being present, listening attentively, and responding with empathy. Swain shows how to do it in a way that feels genuine, not forced or robotic.
I love that. I'm all for making things easier, not more complicated.
Well, Swain doesn't just give the good examples, he also contrasts them with the clinical P.E.P. responses. And let me tell you, they are hilariously cringeworthy.
Ooh, give me an example. I love a good cringe moment.
Okay, remember that micromanaging boss scenario? The clinical P.E.P. response is something like, "Oh, was your boss keeping close tabs on every detail of your work again? And did it feel overwhelming because you wanted more peace?"
Oh my gosh, I can practically hear the eye roll. So unnatural.
Right, like someone took a communication textbook and just threw up all over it.
Haha, exactly. No flow, no authenticity. And the person's response in the book is priceless. Sure, doctor, therapist, shrink coach, psychoanalyst.
It's like Swain is reading our minds, because that's exactly how I'd feel if someone said that to me, not listened to, just analyzed.
Which brings us back to his main point, right? P.E.P. is a tool. But you need to use it skillfully and authentically, or it can backfire.
For sure. And these street P.E.P. conversations really show how to do it right, like little windows into what empathy looks and sounds like in real life.
So what else does Swain cover in these examples? Any other scenarios that might be helpful?
Well, he has one about a romantic relationship where the couple is disagreeing about something.
Orange,
And,
yeah.
oh, yeah. So, like, imagine a couple trying to decide what to do on a Friday night.
Oh, classic dilemma. What could go wrong there?
Right. But it can be a source of tension.
Okay.
Like one person says, let's go see that new action movie. And the other's like, ugh, no way. I'd rather stay in and relax. So, it's easy to get stuck in that my way or the highway mentality.
Totally. Been there.
So Swain gives this example of a street P.E.P. response. Instead of arguing back, you could say, when you hear action movie, does it make you feel kind of drained because you're really wanting to chill tonight?
Okay. So again, acknowledging the feeling and guessing at the value behind it. Wanting to chill.
Right. And what's cool is that it opens up a space for the other person to clarify their feelings, maybe even say, yeah, I've had a long week and I'm just not in the mood for something loud and intense.
So it's like you're not just dismissing their preference, you're actually trying to understand it.
And once you understand it, you can start to find a solution that works for both of you.
Compromise. I'm seeing a theme here.
Exactly. It's not about one person winning the argument. It's about finding a way to meet both of your needs.
Makes sense. So we've seen how street P.E.P. can work in a bunch of different situations. But how do we actually get good at this, like in real life? Does Swain give any tips on how to practice?
He does. In fact, the last part of this chapter is all about exercises to help integrate this being and sounding natural stuff into our lives.
Ooh, empathy homework. This sounds intense.
No tests or grades, I promise. More like self-reflection, experimentation. Like the first exercise asks us to think about our habitual communication style and compare it to a P.E.P. approach.
So how we usually react versus how we could react if we were using P.E.P.
Yeah. Swain suggests imagining a specific scenario, maybe a friend's going through a tough breakup. We think about our usual response, then try to script a new one using P.E.P.
Focusing on understanding their feelings, their values, maybe even revealing a bit of our own vulnerability.
You got it. It's a way to start noticing the difference between, like, those knee-jerk reactions and a more intentional, empathetic approach.
Interesting. So what's next on the empathy training agenda?
The next exercise tackles authenticity head-on. He wants us to think back to a conversation that went south and try to redo it with P.E.P. But got to make it sound natural, not like we're reading from a script.
That's tricky because P.E.P. does have that formula, which can feel kind of rigid.
Right. So this exercise forces you to think about how to use the formula as a guide, but still allow for spontaneity.
And pay attention to your tone of voice, word choice, all that stuff.
Exactly. Because even a small shift in phrasing can change how your message comes across.
Okay, then what?
The third exercise, things get real. Swain takes us into high-stakes situations.
Oh boy. Like when I tried to give my boss constructive feedback and it imploded?
Yeah.
Need help with those.
We've all been there. So he has us recall a moment like that where things got heated and how we handled it. Then imagine applying P.E.P. if a similar situation comes up again.
So thinking strategically, like which parts of the P.E.P. formula to use first, how to adjust our language for that specific context.
Exactly. Because in those tense moments, it's especially important to be careful. Don't want to overwhelm the other person with too much empathy at once.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm starting to see how these exercises could really help us up our P.E.P. game. What else does he have?
Well, remember that Kung Fu analogy? He actually has an exercise about creating an empathy training routine, just like we'd practice any other skill we want to master.
So instead of hitting the gym, we're hitting the empathy dojo.
Exactly. Swain suggests incorporating those P.E.P. principles into our daily lives, whether it's setting aside time for active listening, reflecting on our own feelings and needs, or, challenging ourselves to use P.E.P. in at least one conversation each day.
Making empathy a habit until it becomes second nature. I like that.
Yeah, that's the whole point. And there are a couple more exercises to really round out the training. One focuses on converting that clinical language into natural language.
Give me an example.
Sure. He gives this line. Your body language suggests you're upset. Are you feeling frustrated because your need for appreciation is not being met?
Oh, yeah, we've all heard that one.
Right. And he's like, okay, now make it sound less like a diagnosis and more like a genuine attempt to understand.
So instead of all that, you could say, you seem upset. Is it because you're feeling unappreciated?
Exactly. Much better. And then the final exercise, he tackles that big question. What do you do when someone reacts negatively to your P.E.P. attempts?
Because that's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Not everyone will be thrilled about our newfound empathy.
Oh, for sure. So he gives us this scenario where someone gets defensive and says, why are you talking like a therapist?
Been there.
And then the challenge is to script a P.E.P. response, remembering to empathize even as they're rejecting your approach.
P.E.P. Inception. It's like using empathy to navigate someone's resistance to empathy.
Right. We might say, when you hear me talking like this, does it feel intrusive because you're wanting space, or maybe a different approach?
I see. Validating their reaction and trying to understand the need behind it.
And it shows that even when we face resistance, we can still use P.E.P. to navigate the situation with grace.
So after all this deep dive into being and sounding natural, what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's a reminder that empathy is a skill. It's not something you're born with or you're not. It's something we can learn, practice, get better at over time.
And that P.E.P. formula, as helpful as it is really just a starting point. The real magic happens when we internalize those principles and apply them in a way that feels authentic to us.
Right. We don't have to become P.E.P. robots. We can find our own style, our own voice, and use it to connect with others more deeply. Swain's exercises are a great way to start.
So as we wrap up, dear listener, think about a conversation you had recently that, well, didn't go quite as well as you'd hoped. How might you approach it differently now, armed with these street P.E.P. techniques?
Could you have acknowledged their feelings more directly? Or guessed at the value driving their words? Even a small shift can make a difference.
Practice makes progress. The more you use P.E.P., the more natural it'll become. So go out there and experiment. See how these techniques can transform your conversations.
Until next time, happy empathizing.